from many different backgrounds. I'm also aware that you have a real thirst for intellectual ideas to broaden your horizons, and that's why you have sat here through, how much was it? 277 talks before this one. And that's a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. So the topic I have chosen, as Chandana explained, is cosmology, because it's arguably the oldest intellectual activity of mankind. To wonder about the universe and our place in it. And of course, cosmology means different things to different people. If you were a anthropologist, you would think of it in terms of, for example, the cosmology of the Tibetans, or the cosmology, the dream time of the Australian aborigines. These are cosmologies which not only are about the universe around us, but also about how we should conduct ourselves in that universe. I'm today going to restrict myself to what we might call physical cosmology, which is one of observation, not of developing a belief system that we act upon. So just to make that totally clear from the beginning, right? So the motivation for this particular talk is twofold. One is this ancient symbol, the Ouroboros, which many of you know, the snake swallowing its tail, which illustrates for us the deep connection between the very small and the very large. So what you have here plotted around is the length scale which we are probing through physical means, and that stretches from a very tiny scale that we call the Planck scale, the scale at which gravity, which we all experience as a very weak force, at that scale, gravity becomes as strong as all the other forces in the universe. And we are very short of that. We are actually at the moment in these giant colliders at Geneva and elsewhere, we are exploring scales down to about 1/100,000th of the size of a nucleus, which is plotted around here. And our conceit, our belief, is that the laws that we determine in laboratories such as CERN, which govern the motions of fundamental particles on the scale of 10 to the minus 18 centimeters, actually also determine the evolution of the universe on the very largest scales, up to the scale of the so-called Hubble radius, the size of our universe today. Simply because at one time the entire universe was actually smaller than that. In fact, it was smaller than that. It was probably as small as the Planck scale. And hence this circularity is very pleasing, because it illustrates very directly the connection between the very small and the very large, between inner space and outer space, if you will. Can you all hear me from the back? Do I really need this microphone? Yeah? Okay. Well, they're recording, otherwise I would not normally use a microphone for a room like this. So, in this picture, in this cosmology, if you will, we are in the middle in geometric terms, in the sense that our scale is that of meters, which is about halfway on a logarithmic scale between the very large and the very small. And the motivation for this particular talk I have taken from something that was said by the first person who inspired me to take up cosmology, a great teacher, and that was someone called Dennis Sharma, who is actually better known for his students than for the work that he did himself. That's how generous he was with his ideas. And if I just say that his students included Stephen Hawking, that he inspired Roger Penrose, who you no doubt have heard of, and many others, then you get the idea. And Dennis said, and if I could read it for the benefit of those at the back, none of us can understand why there is a universe, why it should exist. That question, why answer the question, we can at least make progress, simpler one, of what the universe is as a whole like. So, what we see in the universe, and I've already made it clear that our intention is, as Dennis says, to leave aside the more deeper question that some of you might already have in your minds as philosophers, as to why is there anything at all to talk about. We are not going to address that question. We are going to address a much simpler but nonetheless very effective question. Yes? Sorry? I'm going to trace through history. Oh yes, sorry. Oh, that's what you wanted.
I'll make the slides available as a PDF file to the organizers, so maybe they can put that on their Facebook page. You can have it later, right? So the question I'm going to ask, I'm going to trace through history. Now history is a minefield because history is of course recorded by the winners, right? And there is a certain selection effect always. And I know that I'm going to quote, for example, the recorded history that is belongs to mainly European, Greek culture, but that does not mean that I'm not cognizant of the many other cultures, you know, the Mayans, the Incas, the ancient Indians, the Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, who have all had records in cosmology. But the reason I'm going to stick to the Greeks is simply because their record is pretty straightforward and openly accessible. You can look it up, you can just go on the internet and you'll find all these things that I'm going to talk about. Now the Greeks were of course great imperialists. They used to conquer countries left and right. So for them, it was actually both a philosophical and a very practical question. Where is the edge of the universe? And you know, what happens if there is an edge? What happens if you throw a spear across it? Right? So this is attributed to this particular gentleman, Archytas of Tarentum. This is 5th century BC. Now, as usual, when you pose a philosophical question, there are many answers. So one possibility is that there is a wall at the edge of the universe, or the other possibility is that there is a cliff at the edge of the universe, right? So these came to be called the Aristotelian and the Stoic schools. And if you were a, you know, compromise sort of democrat of the day, you might choose that the wall, neither the wall nor the cliff exists. Instead, it kind of becomes a marshy land and there is no real transition, right? That's the compromise solution. And there the matter rested, because once you have defined these schools of thought, there's not much more you can do. So actually my talk, my real agenda is to impress on you is that science is about measurement. Science is not about arguing back and forth about words, because that way you do not make progress. So I'll show you how we came to answer this question about the edge of the universe through measurement. But first let us trace the history of ideas. We fast forward now about 7 centuries to medieval times. This is an illustration from the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. And there we see the earth at the center of the universe with the moon and the sun and the known planets all orbiting around it. And this is the so-called primum mobile. This is the crystalline sphere in which we see the stars as points of light, not moving, unlike the planets which do move. And this is of course how the universe actually looks. The moon does go around us, the sun does go around us, and they simply recorded it as such. It is interesting that Dante, who, I mean, this book is like a, what you might call today a road movie. He's moving, you know, traveling through the universe guided by his muse Beatrice and recording what he sees. And incidentally, for those of you who are a little more advanced, you might be interested in knowing that Dante records that outside the mobile, the primum mobile, the crystalline sphere, he sees converging rays of light ending in an orb of fire. And as you will see later in the talk, that's actually a pretty accurate description of our current understanding of cosmology and the cosmic microwave background in terms of a hypersphere description of our current geometry. But we'll come to that later. And here are some quotes from Dante, which is about this part here, but we won't deal with that now. So the next revolution, as you well know, was that the Earth, far from being the center of the universe, was displaced to being just one more of the planets that orbit the sun. And we recognize that the sun is the center of the solar system. And that is, of course, attributed to Nicholas Copernicus in the 16th century. Perhaps some of you do not know that it was actually noted much, much earlier. So Archimedes recounts during a sabbatical that he spent at Alexandria that there is a man called Aristarchus of Samos who brought out a book consisting of certain hypotheses in which the premises lead to the conclusion that the universe is many times greater than now, so-called. His hypotheses are that the stars and the sun remain motionless, that the earth revolves around the sun in the circumference of a circle, the sun lying in the middle of the orbit. This is in 250 or so BC, okay? So as I said, our impression of the history of the subject is also a little muddled. We don't always acknowledge who actually said something first. Not that it matters, ultimately it becomes shared knowledge, so it's not that important. But if you are interested in the history of science, you should get these things right. Okay. Let's fast forward still further to the time when people started taking this description of the universe seriously, that it had an edge. Okay. And here is a woodcut. Actually, this is from the late 16th century, not medieval times at all. But it shows this hapless traveler who is got stuck at the edge of the universe, and the dilemma is, is he in the universe or is he out of it? I mean, if there is an edge, then you should be able to put your hand through it. And no less than Immanuel Kant formulated this so-called antinomy. Antinomy is like a contradiction, right? A hypothesis that leads to some kind of a contradiction. And his antinomy was that space has to be finite in extent according to this model and homogeneous, and to obey the laws of Euclidean geometry. And in fact, Kant showed in his antinomy that you can't have all three of these premises being true at the same time. Okay. Actually, what later had to give is the laws of Euclidean geometry, as you'll see, right? So I'm just trying to give you a very broad brush history of how we went through all these ideas about the nature of the universe. But because of these contradictions that were raised by the idea of having an edge to the universe, an edge through which you could stick your hand and thereby create a contradiction, we moved on to the idea of an infinite universe. So this was propounded by an English humanist, Thomas Digges. This was 16th century. And those days when people wrote a paper, you drew a picture and you wrote your paper on the outskirts, right? So for example, this says, this orb of stars fixed infinity extended itself in attitude etherically, and therefore immensely the palace of infinite felicity garnished with, etc. It's basically poetry, but what he's trying to say is that the universe, the stars are not fixed on this crystalline sphere, they extend forever. So therefore you solve the problem of what to do with the edge. There is no edge. Okay, the universe is infinite. Now that was of course a nice resolution, and it is interesting to those of you who are interested in literature that there is an allusion to this in Hamlet. Okay, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space. That's an allusion precisely to this debate that was then raging between Tycho Brahe, who was a famous astronomer in Denmark and who had tried to develop a compromised view of cosmology in which all the planets went around the sun, but the sun went around the earth, so he hoped to please both camps. Okay, and Shakespeare at that time, of course, you see the times are the same. This Shakespeare is writing this in 1601. That is when Tycho Brahe was doing his thing, and Thomas Digges. And the debate was therefore about whether we really are the center of the universe and if the universe is indeed infinite. But this notion of an infinite universe, which was seen as a resolution of this problem, ran into a difficulty. And this was first propounded, to my knowledge, by Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer who propounded the laws of planetary motion and finally put the mechanics on a very sound footing when it came to the cosmos. He says, if this is true and they are suns having the same nature as our sun, why do these suns not collectively outshine our sun in brilliance? You do not hesitate to declare that there are over 10,000 stars. The more there are and the more crowded they are, the stronger becomes my argument against the infinity of the universe. The world of ours does not belong to an undifferentiated swarm of countless others. Otherwise, the whole celestial vault would be as luminous as the sun. So Kepler says this in 1601, but it took another 100 years, because those days we obviously didn't have the internet, people didn't get to know about things right away. It took 100 years for this conundrum that Kepler had raised to travel and to get to be responded to by other famous scientists of the time. And here is Edmund Halley, who you know through Halley's Comet. He was in fact the Savilian professor of geometry at Oxford and also the astronomer royal. And he tried to answer Halley's conundrum, and he gave the wrong answer. He said, the more remote stars and those far short of the remotest vanish even in the nicest telescopes by reason of their extreme minuteness, so that though it were true that some such stars are in such a place, yet their beams aided by any help yet known are not sufficient to move our sense, blah blah blah, which is saying that what you would actually think yourself, that surely the distant stars shrink to points, they cannot cover the sky. So clearly there is no problem with having an infinity of stars in the universe, because they would not make the what Kepler argued, that the whole celestial vault could not be as luminous as the sun. Edmund Halley was wrong, and he was wrong because he had not read a book that he had actually paid to have published by his good friend Sir Isaac Newton, the Principia Mathematica, in which Newton had presented formulation of calculus. Okay. In fact, Leibniz had done it before Newton, and today we know that the school of Madhava in Kerala might have done it, summed infinite series before them, but certainly this was the first recorded instance of calculus that has come down to the present day. And that says that if I have a disk and I take it further back from you, it does shrink in size. It shrinks as 1 over the distance square, the inverse square law. But the number of stars at a distance also grows in exactly the same proportion. The two cancel exactly. So Harry only gave half the argument, not the other half. And the other half is that you don't solve the problem like this. And we'll see later, in fact right now, how that works. So imagine you are here, and this is a universe full of stars. Let us divide it into shells. Okay? Let each star put out an energy, let me call it L. So you know by the inverse square law, the surface of a sphere is 4 pi times r square. So that light is going out through a surface whose area is 4 pi r square. So per unit area, the amount of light that is going out is L over 4 pi r square. But then how many stars are in that shell? The number of stars in that shell is proportional to the volume of that shell times the number density of stars. The volume of that shell is 4 pi r square times the width of the shell, which let me call it delta r. So this 4 pi r square and this one cancels, and the luminosity of each shell therefore is just L times delta r times the number density. So this is the only bit of maths I'll introduce, but I really think that a popular talk should not be just about showing you pretty pictures. I want you to go away from here knowing at least one number, and a number that will astonish you. So please bear with me. Okay? So you can see from this simple argument, this is high school mathematics, that each shell of stars is going to contribute an equal amount of light. So obviously if there are an infinite number of shells, then you should get an infinite amount of light. Right? Please do interrupt me at any time if something is not clear. But in fact, you can't have infinity, because in any direction I look, what this is saying is that I should see a star any direction I look, however far away. Something will block my line of sight. But of course, if this guy is blocking my line of sight, then the ones behind don't count. I've already had my sight blocked by a star. I can't have any more. So the problem is not infinity. There's no infinity. But at least the sky should be as bright as the surface of a star, like our sun. So that's a small factor of 10 to the 14 times. So you know what 10 to the 14 is? It's 1 followed by 14 zeros. Okay? So a crore is 1 followed by 7 zeros. So that's a crore times brighter than what we actually see in the sky, right? I think you'll accept that there is a little problem here, right? We have to understand this. We cannot have an infinite universe, otherwise the sky would be a crore times brighter. And this is not the sky at night. It should be the sky in the daytime. It makes no difference, day or night, right? So then people try to suggest various solutions, and one was from a Swiss astronomer who actually gave a sensible suggestion. He said, look, we know that light is absorbed by fog. When you are walking out, it attenuates the light. So maybe the universe is filled with some kind of a fog, dust, right, as you would call it in modern terms. And he says the enormous difference which you find between this conclusion and actual experience shows either that the sphere of the fixed stars is not infinite, but that it is actually much smaller than the extent I've supposed for it, or that the power of light diminishes in greater proportion than the inverse square of the distance. So if the light fell off faster than 1 by r square, then there is no problem. This is plausible. It requires only that the heavens are filled with some liquid capable of intercepting light, absorbing light. Okay, that seems sensible. Unfortunately, this solution does not work. That was not realized in the 18th century. It actually took a little longer, but Lord Kelvin, who some of you would know, was involved in formulating the science of thermodynamics, showed that ultimately that dust which is absorbing the light from the hypothetical stars would itself heat up and start emitting light, right? So in the sense that it takes time, I mean, supposing there's a very hot fire, you put a grate in front of the fire, it does diminish the heat. But if you sit there for a long enough time, that grate will heat up to the point where it itself emits the same radiation that it was intercepting. So you don't win like that. So for this you have to actually calculate how long it takes. It turns out that time is much shorter than the age of the universe. So the problem is actually best posed, in fact, in terms of a picture. And this man, Otto van Guericke, who was a popularizer of science, said, look, imagine you're standing in an infinite forest of trees. So we are standing here. In any direction you look, ultimately the trees are blocking our line of sight. We can't look out of the forest. Now this could be, let's call this the sun tree. So I'm standing here and I'm turning around, and every day I see that tree, half the time. That's the sun tree, right? But there are many, many other suns in the universe. They should be covering the whole sky, not just the bit that I see in the daylight. So I hope this convinces you that there is an issue. This is not some trick with mathematics. So if that is the case, then how can we see through an infinite universe of stars? When we look at the sky, if you can look at the sky, the Hyderabad sky is a little overcast at the moment, but in a good night you can see the Milky Way, and you all know the Milky Way. But when we look away from the Milky Way, we see these dark spaces. We don't see this kind of, the whole sky should have looked like that. It doesn't. So this is the famous question, why is the sky dark at night, which is attributed to a man called Olbers, Olbers' paradox. Olbers was also a popularizer of science in the 19th century, but as I've told you, this problem was first propounded by Kepler 300 years earlier. So this is the point at which it becomes a question of, we have resolved that there is a problem, how do you go about answering it, right? So this is where scientists, physicists in particular, take the point of view that we have to measure things to answer the question quantitatively, okay? There's no more hand-waving qualitative argument. So the question would be, let's go back to that forest. It's not that I can't look through the forest at all. I can look a certain distance before my eye is blocked by trees. I can certainly look in this particular picture, I can apparently look a few hundred meters, and then I can't see any further. So how far do I need to look into a forest before I see this wall of trees? So the answer is that if the radius of the tree trunk is r, so the diameter is 2 times r, and if the number of trees per unit area is n, then the lookout limit, the distance I can look, is 1 over 2 times r times n. Now for a physicist this is trivial. We do what's called dimensional analysis. We need something with the dimension of a length, and there are already 2 parameters in the problem. This is a number per unit area, and this is also a length. So this is the only combination that will give you something in the dimension of a length. But in fact, if you think about it, if the trees are about this big and say spaced about the distance of this size of this room, then you would be able to see about 1 kilometer, and that accords with your intuition. If you are in a pine forest, you can look a lot further than if you are in a forest full of peepal trees or something, right? So what is the extension to the universe? Well, there we are talking about not just 2 dimensions like on the plane, but 3 dimensions, right? You can move up as well as across. Here it's the same formula, but now we are talking about the number of stars per unit volume, and we are talking about the size of the disk of a star, which is pi times r square, where r is the radius. So again, we need to calculate this, but here I gave you some numbers. Here the question is, what is the radius of a star? And what is the distance between stars? Okay, so you have to know what they are. How do you find that out? It's not written on them. When you look at the sky, you just see a flat sky with little dots of light on them. So for this, I have to take you through the history of measurement. And let's start in few hundred BC, 235, Eratosthenes, okay, who was the librarian at the great library of Alexandria. He was a theorist, but he had heard from the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, that when they came from a place called Syene to the south of Alexandria, which we today call Aswan, there is a huge dam there, as you know, they took so many steps to get to Alexandria. In fact, they measured their steps in terms of stadia, how many stadium widths, and they estimated that it was about 500 kilometers, right? Now, Eratosthenes knew that at Alexandria there was a well, and you could see the bottom of the well only on one day in the year, on 22nd June, when the sun is exactly overhead, then the light went down to the bottom of this deep well. So he knew that the sun was exactly overhead at Aswan, but when he went and stuck a stick in the ground outside his library, they called it a gnomon, it cast a shadow. So the shadow of this stick, he measured the angle, it cast a shadow of 7.5 degrees, the thing was inclined. So it's obvious if the sun is overhead at Aswan, but the rays are inclined by 7.5 degrees, it's very simple. 7.5 degrees corresponds to 500 miles or 800 kilometers. Then how much does 360 degrees correspond to? It's easy, it's 40,000 kilometers, right? And then, Archimedes had already given the value of pi, and so he could work out that the Earth's radius is 6,000 kilometers. This is 235 BC. You already knew that the Earth was round. All that stuff you hear about Columbus didn't know that the Earth was round, and that's all complete bogus. Okay, there was a map of the universe, of the Earth, showing that it was round, which is in wide circulation in, for example, the University of Samarkand and so on. Then the distance to the moon. This is Aristarchus, who he encountered earlier. He noticed that when there is a lunar eclipse, the shadow of the moon just about touches the Earth. That's why it's over so quickly, right? But when there is a reverse eclipse of the sun, then in fact the sun is blotted out by the moon. That lasts a little longer. So he worked out from trigonometry that if this is the geometry of the situation, then first of all we can work out that the moon must be at a distance which is 110 times its diameter, because I can hold up a coin about this size and I can just about block the moon, and the length of my arm is 110 times the size of the coin. So it's in the same proportion as the triangle to the moon and the size of the moon. So by doing this, he worked out that the Earth's diameter minus the moon's diameter is about 2.5 times the moon's diameter. And since we already know the Earth's diameter, this allows us to work out the moon's distance. It's about 30 times the Earth's diameter, so it's 400,000 kilometers, right? Next step, the sun, because that's what we are after. So this again, Aristarchus, and he was very clever. He worked out that when the moon is half full, you must have an exact right-angled triangle between the Earth and the sun and the moon. So all you need to do is to measure this angle. You already know this distance, and then by trigonometry you can work out that distance, right? Or this distance, the hypotenuse. Unfortunately, this is where the Greeks, the whole enterprise came to a halt, because they didn't have any instruments. They couldn't measure an angle. He estimated this angle to be 3 degrees, but actually it is a lot smaller than 3 degrees. It's 20 times smaller than 3 degrees. It's only 20 arc minutes, okay? So the sun is actually 400 times further than the moon. Aristarchus thought it was 20 times further. So that distance is 150 million kilometers. Now we are now running into such big scales that we have to use a different unit. We say that it's 500 light seconds, because light is the fastest thing in the universe. It moves at 300,000 kilometers per second, and it takes about 8 minutes to cross the distance from the sun to us. We don't see the sun as it is now, we see it as it was 8 minutes ago. That's how long it takes. But the sun actually subtends the same angle on the sky as the moon, completely by coincidence. So we can work out that the sun's diameter is about 5 light seconds. It's 1.5 million kilometers. So just to give an idea of what scales we are, what we are getting into, we'll have to first measure the distance to the sun, in modern times, this guy didn't measure it. How do I know that the answer is 400 times? For that, you have to observe a transit of Venus. So this is a picture by this man Jeremiah Horrocks, who, as you see, is projecting the sun's disk during a transit of Venus. You can see the disk of Venus, which is between us and the sun, crossing the luminous disk, and you can measure that size. Okay? And it turns out that there is an interesting geometry that the sun's disk is 33 times bigger than Venus, but Venus is 3.5 times closer to the sun, because you can work out that the maximum angle between Venus and the sun is 45 degrees. So then this ratio should be 1 by root 2. And this only works if you assume that Venus is the same size as the Earth. That this man did not know, he just assumed it, but luckily for him that is actually true. Okay? So we finally got to know the distance to the sun in the 17th century. And that distance is about, 10,000 times the Earth's diameter. So here is a picture to show how big the Earth is compared to Venus. As you said, they're about the same size. And all this Mars, Mercury, Pluto has even been demoted now as a planet. But now look at the giant planets. We have become tiny compared to them. Okay? And now let's go to the sun. Jupiter has become tiny. So that's how big the sun is compared to this piddly little Earth. Okay? And the sun is just a typical star. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is 300,000 times further away. How do you know that? We know that because later we realized that because we know the diameter of the Earth's orbit around the sun, as we move around the sun, we are going across 1,000 light seconds, and a star on the sky will appear to move a little bit on the sky. It moves by only 1 second of arc when it is at a distance of 3.3 light years. That's called a parsec. And this measurement was first done by a well-known mathematician, William Bessel. Those days, people didn't believe in the distinction between theory and experiment. Bessel also made measurements, right? And he was the first guy to measure the distance to a particular star, which was about 1/3 of an arc second, which means it's about 3.3 parsecs away, about 10 light years. Today, we have a satellite in orbit called Gaia, and that is measuring these parallaxes down to about a level which is 1,000,000 times better. Okay, that's the advanced instrumentation. So Gaia is going to be able to measure the parallax of not just a few stars, but almost the entire, our galaxy has about 10 to the 11 stars. Gaia is going to measure the parallaxes of most of them. So we will finally be able to map out our galaxy. This process is happening right now. But still, we are within our galaxy. We have to go further. And for that, you have to develop the distance ladder. So in order to measure distances to other objects, we need to know a standard candle. It's like, having a 100-watt bulb. If you put my 100-watt bulb across a distant field, because I know how bright it is intrinsically, I can estimate how far it is. Okay? I have to know that it's 100 watt. Okay? If you change the 100-watt bulb for a 40-watt bulb, then I can be fooled. Now, has nature provided us such things? The answer is yes. Here is an object which is becoming brighter, then fading, and then becoming brighter again. It's called a Cepheid variable. Its brightness fluctuates. Okay? The phase changes with time, and there is a correlation between how bright it is and the periodicity. So if I just measure how much the period is changing, the brightness is changing with time, the period of this object, I can read off from this plot exactly how bright it is intrinsically. And this discovery was made by this lady, Henrietta Leavitt, one of the unsung heroines of science. At that time, obviously, they didn't have professorships in big universities. She developed this distance technique for Cepheid variables. But Edwin Hubble, who in fact was at Oxford, although he studied law rather than astronomy, he used her technique to look at the Andromeda galaxy, which is the closest galaxy to us. And you see in the outskirts, he spotted a Cepheid variable. He has written the word VAR for variable. And he realized that Andromeda is not just a little luminosity within our Milky Way, as it was thought to be. It's actually very, very far away. Because if you use that Leavitt Cepheid variable relation, then it is at least 800 kiloparsecs, 800,000 parsecs away, nearly 1,000,000 parsecs away. This is what our nearest galaxy looks like, Andromeda. It's very much like our galaxy. It's a spiral galaxy with these pronounced arms, and it's about 2.2 million light years away from us. But now comes the era of modern telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope, which has just been decommissioned. There'll be a better one in orbit soon. And the Hubble Space Telescope could see Cepheid variables in more distant galaxies. So here is a galaxy called M100, and in the outskirts of M100, here is a star that is waxing and waning. It's a Cepheid variable, and we can work out just exactly how bright that is. And from that, we can work out that that galaxy, which is in a cluster called the Virgo cluster, to which we also belong, is 54 million light years away. So you see, I'm giving all these numbers to impress on you how we are building up this distance ladder, and how long it has taken to do all this, and what technology it took to do that. Okay, you needed to fly a telescope in orbit to be able to resolve a Cepheid variable. Now, Cepheids can calibrate other sources which you can see right across the universe. So here is that same M100 galaxy again, and occasionally a star explodes. The whole star explodes and becomes a supernova, and when it does that, it is as bright as the entire host galaxy. So luckily for us, a supernova went off in 2006, and it's called X because it was the 24th supernova that year. And that supernova came to a peak, and then it waned, and you can actually tell from the way the light is declining that it is a so-called type 1a supernova. It is like a giant hydrogen bomb, and that is the radioactive decay of nickel 56, which is powering that light curve. That supernova we then can calibrate because we already know the distance to M100. So we know exactly how much light that supernova put out. And then we see that those similar supernovae inferred much more distant galaxies. So therefore, we can now use supernovae to see as far as we want to see, and we know their distance to billions of light years. So that's how long it has taken till 1996 from the first measurements by Aristarchus and Eratosthenes in 250 BC. So now I can calculate the answer. Remember, it was all about determining the size of a star and how far apart they are. So R is the radius, and I showed you this formula earlier. So the typical star size, let's say, is the same as the sun. They actually come in different sizes, but typically 5 light seconds. And the average separation, taking account of the fact that some are in galaxies and that the galaxies are separated by larger distances, it's about 1,000 light years. If I put that into that formula, the answer that I get is that this bright wall of stars that people talked about, that Kepler was worried about, that people try to pose as the bright sky paradox, that wall of stars is 10 to the 23 light years away. In other words, I have to look out 10 to the 23 years to see that wall of stars. Okay, that's how big that number is. I have to confess that first time I came across this argument, which you will not find, by the way, in any astronomy textbook. They all give the wrong answer for why the sky is bright at night. So you are going to learn something that you probably would not get from a textbook. The question we have to ask is the universe that old? Because the light has to be traveling towards us for 10 to the 23 years. Actually, the Earth is only about 5 billion years old. We know that from radioactive dating of uranium and all that, right? And we can similarly determine by looking at old stars, they have uranium, and we can look at the amount of uranium, that is a spectral line of uranium, and you see this red line is going through the data points, and that allows us to measure what is the abundance of uranium. And using something called the Very Large Telescope, which is a state-of-the-art telescope in Chile, run by the European Southern Observatory, we can work out that the age of that oldest star in our galaxy is only about 12.5 billion years. It's only about twice as old as our sun, okay, little over twice. It's nowhere near 10 to the 23 years old. So the answer to the question, why the sky is dark at night, is that really there aren't enough stars in the universe to cover the sky. The density of stars is too low to cover the sky. And the person who first gave this answer is not a scientist. it was somebody that you know better as a poet and a writer, Edgar Allan Poe. He said, were the succession of stars endless, then the background of the sky would present to us an uniform luminosity like that displayed by the galaxy, since there would be absolutely no point in that background at which there would not exist a star. That's exactly the formulation of the bright sky paradox. The only mode, therefore, in which we could comprehend the vistas in which our telescopes find would be by supposing the distance of this background to be so immense that no ray from it has yet been able to reach us at all. Now, I have no idea how Edgar Allan Poe arrived at this amazing conclusion, which it has taken us until very recently to arrive at, but there is the answer. Okay? So let me explain how that works. When we point that Hubble telescope at a point in the sky which is totally blank, and that's exactly what the director of the telescope did. He gets some time on the telescope, his private time, and he decided to look at the most boring patch of sky he could find. Okay? A patch of sky that from the back of the room would be about the size of the tip of my finger, a little patch. When the Hubble telescope looked at it, however, it found thousands and thousands of galaxies in that little patch. This is our deepest view of the universe. So you can work out that if there are several thousand galaxies in this tiny little patch of sky, then over the sky there are 10 to the 11 galaxies. There are 100 billion galaxies, right? So in fact, even at that distance, the stars are not, the galaxies are not covering the sky. We are seeing all these dark spaces between them. That's what I said earlier. There are not enough galaxies or stars to cover the sky. So what is beyond that? Well, then we have to realize that when you are looking back into the past, we are looking in time, we are actually looking into the past. So I told you that we are seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. We are seeing the nearest star as it was 4 years ago. We are seeing the galactic center, the Milky Way, as it was 30,000 years ago. We are seeing Andromeda 2 million years ago. We are seeing Virgo as it was 50 million years ago. And this Hubble ultra deep field, we are seeing galaxies as they were up to 12 billion years ago. So we are actually traveling in time. Time travel is possible, okay, but only into the past, not the future, okay. And we are doing it all the time. Every time you look at the sky, in fact, every time I look at you, I'm doing time travel because I see you as you were some nanoseconds ago. Light is taking a finite time to come to me. The present is unknowable. We can only know the past, and of course the future will happen to us. So this is like taking a tunnel in time, and the galaxies we are seeing back in time to when they were the primitive objects, and they're evolving to become the galaxies that you see in the present universe from these half-shaped things. They undergo cannibalism, they combine with each other, and the other thing is that their spectra are different from the ones that we see locally. As we look further and further, the same spectral lines are being shifted towards the red of the spectrum. And this shift we call the red shift. It's called Z for red shift, and that is just the fractional change in the wavelength as we go away, right? And if you interpret that as a velocity, then these things are traveling away from us at huge velocities. So this is what Hubble showed, that the further a galaxy is, the faster it is moving away from us. I always like this cartoon in the New Yorker that says, every time I see Edwin Hubble, he's moving rapidly away from me, right? And he owes him money. So this is the expansion of the universe. Hubble's data from 1929, actually it was other people's data, he plotted it. This is the velocity of recession, this is the distance, you see a linear relationship, and today that data is actually just that tiny bit there. This is how much further we have gone. Okay? So I'm going to go a little fast because I realize I've already used up most of my time. If I can have just 5 more minutes. Thank you. So what we find is that galaxies equidistant from us are all moving away at the same speed. So these little arrows are indicating the size of the speed with which they're moving away. So galaxies twice as far are moving away twice as fast. The arrows have got twice as big. What happens if I reverse the arrows? Then the one which is twice as far is moving twice as fast. It will come in twice as fast. And the one that is 3 times further away is moving 3 times as fast. It will come in 3 times as fast. So they will all reach the center at the same time. And that time is the inverse of the rate of expansion, the so-called Hubble parameter, and that's about 14 billion years. Same as the age of the oldest stars that we found earlier, right? Actually, the redshift of galaxies is not a Doppler effect. it's something that happens in curved space-time. And let me show you graphically, or rather through this cartoon. Imagine you are on this balloon that is being blown up, right? We are sitting at some point, just some arbitrary point like the North Pole, and basically the balloon is getting bigger, and the wavelength of light, as you see, is being stretched out because light travels at a constant velocity with respect to the fabric of the balloon. That fabric of this balloon is space-time. And therefore, the same wavelength has become stretched out, and that is the redshift. It is got actually, it's not quite right to think of it as a Doppler effect that leads to difficulties. This is the correct explanation. So, this picture is also very good because now we can understand that you could have picked any point of that balloon. Every point it looks the same. Everything is going away from you. So, there is no center to the expansion. Every point is the center. And in fact, as this balloon expands, the light is coming to us along the balloon, and the antipodal point of this, what would be technically called a hypersphere, that is the Big Bang, BB. Here is the Earth. Okay? So going back in time, this balloon was smaller and smaller and smaller, and it began, we believe, currently our picture is that it began in what we would call a space-time singularity, according to the classical equations that we now have. Ultimately, one day we hope to understand what happens near there, and there are current research is focusing on that. But currently, we do know that when the universe was younger, because it was smaller and more compact, it was hotter. So if I look out, this is the Hubble Space Telescope, we looked out and we saw the edge of the distribution of galaxies. But if we looked out further and further beyond the first stars, we should ultimately, the universe should become hot enough that it should become ionized, just like the light in those tube lights, it is a plasma. You should see that wall of plasma. And in fact, this is exactly what these two guys at Bell Labs discovered when they pointed that huge telescope to the sky. They saw that there was a radiation coming from the whole sky. There is a bright sky, but it is not at the wavelengths that our eyes can see. It is at microwave wavelengths because the light has been stretched out, redshifted to microwave frequencies. Okay? And this light was released from that plasma, you can see in this picture, from this thing here, 400,000 years ago. 400,000 years after the Big Bang, which means about 14 billion years ago. Right? And this telescope, which was flown on a satellite by NASA in 1992, measured the spectrum of that radiation. And this is the spectrum. It is almost exactly a so-called Planckian spectrum, a black body spectrum. Perfect. This is like the kind of plot you draw in a textbook, and here it is written on the sky. And that tells us that the early universe was hot and dense. We did begin in a Big Bang. There is no way to escape that conclusion. But that picture was fuzzy. This is like a picture of the Earth. You can't make out what's going on. If I improve the focus, then you can make out the continents. There is India, right? So after some years, we launched another satellite, the Wilkinson WMAP. NASA launched this. And now it began to see that the radiation is not quite uniform. That radiation has a temperature of 3 degrees Kelvin, 2.73 degrees Kelvin, but there are fluctuations in it which are of order 100 microkelvin, which means about 10,000 times smaller. Okay? And those fluctuations I can't cover in this talk, but the amazing story is that we believe that those fluctuations are quantum fluctuations, because they originate from a time when the entire universe was smaller than the size of a nucleus. And it was a quantum object, and it fluctuated like all quantum objects fluctuate. And that is written on the sky in structures that are now hundreds and thousands of megaparsecs across. So that is the biggest Schrodinger's cat in the universe for those who follow these things. Now these fluctuations excited sound waves in the plasma of the early universe, and those fluctuations are the ones that grew to become the galaxies that we live on. And the latest mission that we have flown, the Planck satellite, has measured them in even more detail. And I can't explain this picture, but this is the data summarized in terms of what we call an angular power spectrum. And I just want you to notice that the data and the theory are in remarkable agreement. We do have a first principles understanding now of how the universe and all its contents arose from starting with small initial fluctuations, which then grew under gravitation in the dark matter that fills the universe to give us the universe that we live in today. And this is what is the standard model of cosmology. So what we are seeing in the microwave background is the edge of the visible universe. That's how far we can look with light, or in this case microwaves. It's the same thing, they're photons. And there's a nice quote due to Max Tegmark, a colleague at MIT, which I like. He says our entire observable universe is inside this sphere of radius 13.3 billion light years. Space continues outside the sphere, but this opaque glowing wall of hydrogen hides it from our view. The censorship is frustrating, since if you could just see 380,000 light years beyond that, we would behold the beginning of the universe. We can't see it because there is this fog in the way. Is it always going to be like that? Maybe not. Because if you look at this picture, as I said, the fluctuations were generated at some early phase. We call it inflation. We don't really understand what that process was. That's just a placeholder. But those fluctuations can grow to the galaxies that we live in. And in order to understand what is going on, you have to go beyond this point. You have to go to this era. How do you do that? We can't do that with light, but we could do that with gravitational waves. And the proposal is to fly 3 satellites around the Earth, separated by millions of kilometers, whose distance will be measured to a precision of microns. Okay? And then we'll be able to measure ripples in space-time, which, as you know, were detected recently by the LIGO detectors on Earth. And there is going to be LIGO India quite soon. One of the arms will be installed in India in another 2, 3, 4 years. And this is the next step. We'll aim to detect gravitational waves from the very early universe, thereby opening up this era, and who knows how far back we can go. Maybe we can go back to the Big Bang itself. So I have taken enough of your time. Let me conclude by giving the answer to what's beyond the observable universe. Lots and lots of unobservable universe, okay? So that we'll talk about some other time. But let me just leave you, if this has whetted your appetite for cosmology, let me recommend to you 3 books that I have drawn on for this talk. Edward Harrison is a distinguished cosmologist. He is British, but he worked in the US at the University of Amherst in Massachusetts. And he has a book in which he traces that history that I told you about. Robert Osserman was the Dean of Mathematics at Stanford. He wrote a book called Poetry of the Universe, and I think maybe people think it's some new age book or something. It's not very popular. It's the best exposition I've found of explaining what's curved space-time to a lay audience. So I very strongly recommend that book. It's still in print. And there is, of course, a classic book by Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate, particle physicist, called The First 3 Minutes, which tells you about what happened at the end of the first 3 minutes. But if you are going to ask me what is really curved space-time, I cannot help you because I have just shown you a simple calculation. You will have to learn tensor calculus, okay? You can simplify science, but you can't simplify it further. There is a point at which you have to do the work. You have to put in the graft. So there is a limit to how much one can popularize it, but I hope I have at least given you some sense of the ideas that underlie it, and those ideas we can also...
Visible universe, you just mentioned dark matter. Can you talk a little bit about dark matter? Because I believe 85% of the universe is dark matter.
Yes. Can I say something about dark matter? Well, we believe that, yes, indeed, there is about 6 times as much dark matter as there is the matter that shines in galaxies. Actually, most of the visible matter is actually in the form of a X-ray emitting plasma in clusters of galaxies. And the reason is, I can explain to you very simply what the argument for dark matter is. You see here, today is the present universe, the so-called cosmic web of galaxies, and there are fluctuations in that as well. And if I ask what is the size of those fluctuations, they're like 100%. There is an average background, but the fluctuations on top of that are as strong as the background. Okay? Like our galaxy, it's a huge fluctuation. When we look at these fluctuations here, we also see little fluctuations. Those fluctuations are about 10,000 times, 1/10,000th of the average. They're 10,000 times smaller than today. Okay. Now, fluctuations can grow under gravity, and we know precisely at what rate they grow. This was an argument according to a Soviet cosmologist called Lifshitz, a physicist. In between here and here, the universe has expanded by a factor of 1066. We know that. We can measure the scale factor. So the fluctuations could have only grown by a factor of 1000 because they grow in an expanding universe proportional to the scale factor. Now, if I start with fluctuations which are 1 in 10,000 and I grow them by a factor of 1000, they will still be 1 in 10. But the fluctuations I see here are not 1 in 10, they are of order 1. They are as pronounced as the background. So in other words, the fluctuations actually should have been growing before the universe became transparent. Normally in a plasma, fluctuations cannot grow because the baryons and the photons are tightly coupled to each other, like there's a spring connecting them. There's a Coulomb force. So it must be the case that there must be some form of matter in which the fluctuations can grow by another factor of 10 or so, and that matter cannot interact with radiation, otherwise the fluctuations would be wiped out, they would be damped, as we say technically. So therefore, we have to invoke about 10 times more matter than visible matter in order to explain why there are galaxies today starting with these seeds. Okay? So it's like, you see a fully grown tree in your garden and you know how long it takes for the tree to grow, right? And therefore you can conclude that the sapling was not planted last year, it must have been planted 10 years ago, right? So that is the difference between here and where actually the dark matter came to dominate. So you have to invent dark matter in order to explain why there is structure in the universe. And then there is other evidence as well from the speed at which galaxies are, stars are going around galaxies. It's called the rotation curve of galaxies, gravitational lensing, many other lines of inquiry, right? In fact, I'm lecturing precisely on this topic at the IIT right now on dark matter. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I think many people may have had the same question. I'll keep my answers briefer from now on.
I would like you to throw some light whether there is any connect between the scientific cosmology topic that you have given a talk on and parallel universe, which we oft hear. Maybe it's fiction, I don't know.
No, so in parallel universes, but I think you got the idea that when we actually look at the universe, we are only seeing up to a limited extent, okay? And in principle, this picture will serve to describe it. This is our cartoon view of how the universe actually originated, right? From there. Now, you could always have a theoretical speculation as to what happened at the time, and the possibility that different universes branched off, right? So that the universe we inhabit is simply one of a vast landscape of possible universes. But that at the moment is just speculation, okay? The only universe we can study is the one that we live in. Now, we might be able to conclude on philosophical grounds that there could be parallel universes, and indeed in some extensions of current thinking about physics, that possibility does arise, and it's a fascinating possibility anyway, so we'll think about it. But we have right now no empirical direct way to measure parallel universes. And I'm interested in measurement, so I will ignore parallel.
Mars. Do you think we would be able to colonize Mars in our lifetime or in this century?
Colonize Mars?
Yes.
Well, why do you want to colonize? Hardly any atmosphere on Mars. There may be water, but it will be very hard to get it out and use it. Right on Earth, there are tens and hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of land that is not used. We call them the great deserts. I can assure you it is much more easier to even live at the bottom of the oceans on Earth than to go and live on Mars. Okay? So I think we should live with the planet that we have and try to take care of it. The problem with these ideas about going to other places is that then we say, all right, we can, just make a dustbin of the place we are in, and because we can always escape somewhere.
My question is about the Big Bang Theory. I wonder how we can justify our argument that the endless universe, which doesn't have any outer wall or end, could have started with just something so small as a nucleus.
Recourse to the part of the universe we can observe. And from that we can deduce that this bit of the universe, in principle, so let me bring back that picture so you can actually clearly illustrate what I mean. This is what we observe. we observe that galaxies which are far away from us are moving away from us, and the further they are, the faster they're moving away. So if I just reverse their motions in time, they will all reach the same point at the same time. But that point is everywhere. That point is not one point in space. So I asked you to imagine that you are sitting on a ball. The Big Bang is the opposite point of that ball, wherever you are. That ball, the point that you pick is arbitrary. I don't care if you're sitting at the North Pole, South Pole, equator, whatever. The Big Bang is the antipodal point, the opposite point on the sphere. And you see, on a sphere, what happens, and in fact, there is that picture later which shows, you see, on the sphere, as you go out from us, okay, the circle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But once you cross the equator, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the Big Bang covers your whole sky because the light from it is coming to you along every direction, okay? So you see the light from here is coming like that, the light from there is coming like that. So a single point can cover your whole sky. This is curved space-time. For this we have no intuition because we live in flat space-time. We are creatures of the environment that we live in. We can only grasp this mathematically. We can't grasp this from our experience. But you better believe the maths.
Assuming the distance to the singularity is different from the 1x, 2x, 3x, but if they are approaching at the same time, it means the velocity is same. So can it be characterized by the e power x curve? Because
no, I already lost you. I've already said that distance is at different distances from the singularity. Everything was in the singularity. Okay, this picture here. Okay, everything was starting from there. Everything was at the same place, at the same time, and that place was everywhere. Okay, when I say that in English, it sounds weird, but that's what this description, this is a particular so-called metric, and that metric has this singularity.
Yes,
okay?
So
that question that you just posed is not meaningful in that context.
To reiterate, in a way, the rate at which it approaches is the same. So can it be characterized as the e power x curve? Because at every point on the e power x curve, the slope is the same. The rate of e power minus x or e power x, the slope, the rate of the slope is the same as the curve at the point.
Okay, so this is not e to the power, that would be, that expansion rate would be what would be called a de Sitter expansion. What we are talking about here, we yet don't know whether it's a power law expansion or a de Sitter expansion. Very close to the Big Bang, indeed we invoke this period called inflation, which would actually be e to the power Hubble parameter times time, right? An exponential expansion. But that space cannot be everlasting. That was called the steady state theory, where in fact it was like that. We have abandoned it because we now know that the universe had a beginning in time. It has not existed forever.
On another note, Professor, this was in reference to Vishwesvaraya lecture by Lyman in ICTS Bangalore. So, regarding the CMB, why is the CMB also close to E, the 2.73? It's with the fluctuations.
That is just a coincidence because that is the temperature measured in degrees Kelvin. If I measured it in a different scale, it will be a different number. There is no significance to that.
There is one question.
Yeah.
Second one part is
second question.
Entropy of the universe is increasing. You are saying universe size is also increasing.
Yes.
So what is the relation between these two?
Between the size and what?
Entropy of the universe is
the entropy of the universe is not increasing in the sense that it has been born already with such a large amount of entropy that all the entropy that we generate is minuscule. It's less than 1 part in a billion compared to what is already there. So to a very good approximation, the entropy of the universe is not changing. I mean, the second law holds, you are right about that. And there is an interesting effect, which is that gravity, okay, which is the force that binds things together, actually can create, in a sense, it can create order. So for example, in this room we have order, okay. How did you make that order? Because we are illuminated by the light from the sun. That has allowed us to, you know, plants do photosynthesis, creatures evolve, etc., etc. We organize ourselves. How has the sun got its energy? By gravitational collapse. So gravity has a interesting property called negative specific heat. It can actually allow you to create localized regions where there is order, even though the overall entropy of the universe by the second law does have to increase. But the answer is that that increase is by less than 1 part in a billion of the total amount of entropy that is already there in the universe. So to a very good approximation, the entropy is constant. And your other question was? Tunnel experiment, right. So that was the Large Hadron Collider, which is in a 27-kilometer tunnel, indeed, in Geneva. And what was discovered there was the prediction that there is a particle called the Higgs particle, which is an excitation of something called the Higgs field, which actually fills the entire universe, right? And you and I are excitations of particles in this Higgs field, which acquire mass by interaction with this particle, okay? So the electrons and protons and whatever we are made of, they get mass by interacting with this Higgs field. And this sounds like a science fiction story, but people built this 27-kilometer tunnel. They built 2 huge detectors. They looked for signs of this Higgs particle, and they found it. That's how we progress. The stories we tell are actually proved to be real because we get the data and it fits the theory and it is mathematically precise. Okay? Now that would correspond, the Higgs field would correspond to a time here of about 100 GeV, which is long before this point here. It will be somewhere here. At a time when the universe was about 10 to the minus 12 seconds old. We have not yet directly seen back to there. But one day we hope to do that. Maybe at the Large Hadron Collider.
Is it a kind of an outburst from a central point or a kind of a collision?
No, it is neither, because the Big Bang at which our current description of the universe stops, because it is a singularity. So again, let me show this picture to illustrate what I'm talking about. The Big Bang is simply the point at which this balloon shrinks to a point, okay? But of course there is no balloon, okay? There is no balloon. It was an analogy, don't take that literally. The point is that just as if somebody was blowing up a balloon, you would expect that there is a point to which it would shrink like that, right? So seen from the Earth, all the galaxies would approach us, but you would see the same picture from anywhere that you are located. So effectively, what we are seeing is that the Big Bang is basically when this thing was going down back and back to a single point. But this is just a picture because I can't draw 4-dimensional space-time. So I have had to draw it on this screen. So think of it as a singular point where time was created, the time that we call time, right? When I say 14 billion years after the Big Bang, the zero of time was then, right? I cannot tell you what happened at the Big Bang because our physical theories only allow us to go back to what this gentleman was asking, to about 10 to the minus 10 seconds after the Big Bang. If you ask me what happened in the first 10 to the minus 10 seconds, my answer would be we do not know because we cannot experimentally prove that.
Sir, even black hole has this point of singularity, right?
Exactly. So there is really a deep connection, and indeed the 2 big challenges for a theory of quantum gravity, which people are working on now, is to explain the black holes and to explain the Big Bang, and the 2 do have this relation. In both cases, we believe that the singularity would be resolved by developing a quantum theory rather than the classical theory that we now use. Currently, it's proved to be a very difficult problem.
Science, cosmology, cosmology is converging what spiritual mystics used to say. For example, in Hinduism, they said God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. In Zen, they say void, and Shunyata in Buddhism. So, don't you think?
So as I said at the beginning of the lecture, cosmology is a loaded word. It means different things to different people. The cosmology that we are talking about, I said I would specifically restrict myself to physical cosmology. That's something that is described mathematically that I can share with all of you. You can reproduce my calculations, you can test it. The other aspect of cosmology that you're talking about, indeed, that's a very profound part of our experience, but it depends on who you are, okay? A Zen master's approach to cosmology is quite different from a Hindu mystic's, it's quite different from a Sufis and so on, or from the dream time of the Australian Aboriginals. It is not a shared set of knowledge. It's a belief system that anthropologically would be classified as a cultural construct. What I talked about is not a cultural construct, it is real. This is based on things you can measure. So obviously I do not deny that that is a fascinating and important part of our being sentient creatures. Yeah, but I cannot necessarily assume that everyone in this room would share my particular belief system. So that's why I choose not to talk about it. And by the way, that's something that you can use to guide your own behavior and your own direction in life. I'm interested in my professional work as to how far we can understand the laws of physics, which is a much more limited
Question
task.
to you is, I happened to read a couple of days ago that we are approaching a mini ice age in the next, say, about 2 to 3 decades,
Yes.
right? Because of the sunspot activity. And
Yes.
Could you throw some light on that? And also, if you could, elaborate a little further on what kind of climate change impact can be?
About which we have just begun to understand. So if I just tell you that there is this widespread idea that our releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is causing climate change. Actually, we can only account for about 2/3 of the carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere. We still do not know where 1/3 of the carbon dioxide goes, how it is returns to the system, right? So the models of climate, which are becoming increasingly sophisticated, nevertheless have large gaps of knowledge, because the earth is a very complex system. And it is almost, some people believe it's a self-regulating system. Okay, there is a famous Gaia hypothesis propounded by James Lovelock, who actually was a top scientist. He invented the very sensitive sensor for rare trace elements, which actually first showed that the DDT had traveled all the way to the Antarctic and essentially started this whole ecological consciousness thing. But he, I recall giving a talk where he was arguing that, we know so little about, for example, what people talk about the hole in the ozone layer, etc. He was trying to say we really ought to understand the system better before we think that we completely understand what is going on. Now, I don't say that, I'm obviously not denying the reality of climate change, that's all around us, but I think more work is necessary, and of course, I don't need to say that, even governments have recognized that now, and there are many, many scientists who are trying to pin down the nature of climate change, get better indicators, get better diagnosis of exactly what has happened. Because this mini ice age you talked about, we actually have weather records going back about 186,000 years, if I remember correctly. Because we can take a ice core, in Greenland or in the Antarctic, there are bubbles of air trapped there, and we can measure their carbon dioxide content, and we can also estimate the temperature, and it shows that there were, in the last 200,000 years or so, there were 2 rises and falls in temperature. Okay, this is long before we even appeared on the planet. So there are clearly forces at work which we need to understand. And in fact, Lovelock jokingly said, we better do a bit of global warming so we can ward off the ice age, which is due according to the, Obviously, he was suggesting that we are basically quite ignorant, and we should not imagine that we understand the problem well enough to be, very prescriptive about what should be done about it. But I think one thing we can all agree on, we need to reduce how much energy we use. Because when you use energy by the second law of thermodynamics, which was referred to earlier, you have to dispose of it. And that creates entropy. Okay, disorder. You heat up the oceans, life will stop, be able to survive there ultimately. So the solution for the world is not cheap energy. The more energy we produce, the more we'll keep the lights on, and all of us will get a car, and you can already see what's happening on the streets when everyone gets a car. Okay, we have to reduce our demand. So sorry, I'm drifting off the subject of this lecture, but I think this ice ages and global warming should make us realize that our planet, although it's very robust, it is self-regulating to a large extent, but it is not infinitely robust. Okay, we have to take care of it. And the answer is not in going and colonizing other planets. The answer is in learning how to use less, how to live with less, how to economize, and that is surely something that will resonate with the other gentlemen who referred to our ancient texts, because that is exactly what our ancient texts say. Live in harmony with nature. Don't try to conquer it and subjugate it and exploit it and use it all up.
My question is, what is rest mass? And if the universe is constantly moving, how is rest mass valid?
Okay, so says in the words, it is the mass of a particle even at rest, right? When a particle moves, its mass actually increases, because Einstein told us that basically these two things are inconvertible, right? Famous equation E equals mc square. That's actually a definition of the mass, but effectively what it says is that you can convert mass into energy.
If a particle moves, it has kinetic energy. That is actually equivalent to a mass, right? And we know that Einstein was right because we are actually alive because of the energy from the sun, which is basically a giant hydrogen bomb. It's not burst exploding because it's held together by gravity, right? So rest mass is the intrinsic property of a particle which is acquires, we now know the answer, by interaction with the Higgs field, which we talked about earlier. So rest mass is an intrinsic property of a particle. An electron has such and such a mass, a up quark has such and such a mass, a Higgs boson has such and such a mass, all through interactions with the Higgs field. That's the answer to your first question. And the second question was? The motion of the universe has nothing to do with the rest mass. The rest mass is due to the interaction of the particle with the Higgs field, which pervades the whole universe. So I'm interacting with the Higgs field right here. That's why the electrons in my body weigh whatever they do. I don't care if do I know that the universe is moving? I don't know anything. I'm just standing here in this nice auditorium. So locally we don't know anything about the universe moving. You have to make all these observations to find it out. So it has no effect.
Big Bang itself reversible? In that sense, is time a reversible thing?
Well, mathematically sure. What happens if you reverse the expansion in time, you will go back to the Big Bang. Now, somebody is going to ask me what was before the Big Bang, and the answer is it's cut off by the edge of this slide, so don't ask me, right? But actually the answer is that you can't pose that question, and Hawking actually put it very nicely. It's like asking what is north of the North Pole. By definition, there is nothing north of the North Pole. That is the center of the coordinates. Similarly, the Big Bang is, according to this picture, the beginning of time. There is nothing before the Big Bang. Now, having said that, you might have come across in discussion in the scientific literature of people talking about pre-Big Bang. Of course, you can construct a different mathematical formulation where there is a previous universe and somehow we come past that singularity and emerge into this one. But that is not what we observe. That is outside the realm of direct physical measurement. That is something we can speculate about.
Why is the universe not yet destroyed by the annihilation of matter and antimatter?
Okay, fact that we are here today is a real miracle. All the matter and the antimatter in the universe should have annihilated and created pure radiation. Actually, that microwave background radiation you see is that radiation. It has been redshifted to microwave wavelengths. But the real question one ought to be asking is, why is there any matter left at all? We are there. Now, we are a tiny sprinkling of matter. There are, for every billion photons in the microwave background, there is one particle like of proton or neutron. Okay? So we are a slight trace of matter sprinkled on top of a sea of radiation. Most of the universe is actually radiation. And why there is a little bit of matter left is a big question. This is a puzzle that we believe we can solve in principle, but for that we have to extend our understanding of fundamental particle physics beyond the point we are at today. In the standard model which we have today, there is no way to make this excess of matter over antimatter. Okay? So we have to go beyond the standard model, and that's very exciting because in the laboratory when you test the standard model, it fits all the data, everything. Okay? There's no flaws in it. But we know from our very existence that there must be new physics beyond it at higher energies to create, for example, this little asymmetry, which the process by which that was created we call baryogenesis, the genesis of baryons. Baryons are the particles we are made of. This is an open question and an area of very
Does the solar system itself expand?
No, because the solar system, the expansion which are so large, right, that the systems in question are not bound. So if everything was expanding, you would not know that anything is expanding because your scale ruler is also expanding, right? By definition, you don't have to be a scientist to work that out. So atoms are not expanding. The solar system is not expanding. Our galaxy is not expanding. It's only the distances between very far galaxies that are on average expanding. Even Andromeda is falling towards us. It's not going away from us because Andromeda will, and we are bound gravitationally. And in fact, Andromeda will hit us in about 5 billion years. And then it's all over for us. You have just 5 billion years. Okay?
But if you go to a scale, Andromeda is, as I said, 800 kiloparsecs away. If you go to a scale of about 10 megaparsecs, which is about 15 times the distance, then you will start seeing the expansion, right? So it's not really an expansion, because I don't like to use the word expansion, because then you can ask me, what is it expanding into? There is nothing except the universe. What are we expanding into? All that we can say is that I have a metric, I have a description of the space-time, and that is all that there is. That is something that enables me to interpret the redshifts of distant galaxies in terms of a stretching of the wavelength. That's what enables me to estimate the distance. This is all within a mathematical construct, okay? What we call reality is a mathematical construct of physical, phenomena. So I cannot answer a question which is posed beyond that framework. I can only address a question that is within that framework. That is not to deny that there cannot be other frameworks, but this is the one that I know something about and I can talk about. Other frameworks such as this, we have to leave for another discussion. Can Venus support life? Well, depends on what kind of life you are. I believe there are bacteria that will live at few hundred degrees centigrade. That's the surface of Venus. It's also extremely corrosive. You and I would die in a second, okay? But the life, if you expand your view of what life is, it won't be things with, bacteria can probably live there. I mean, we don't know what the range of life in the universe might be. It need not be carbon-based.
Earth had before. So can it support life which
In the future?
Yeah,
That's a good question. Indeed, Earth also had a poisonous atmosphere, and today it doesn't. And amino acids formed through lightning, etc., proteins formed, etc., and suddenly there was life. Well, the only way to do is do the experiment. Wait 5 billion years, see if life comes up on Venus. Okay. I don't think we know enough about how life actually emerges to be able to predict that. But you are right, given enough time, it can happen. Life is complexity, right? So given enough time, that can indeed happen. Fred Hoyle famously said that the probability of life happening by chance is the probability of a tornado going through a waste bin and assembling a 747, right? That's unlikely. But he actually made a mistake. The thing is, it doesn't happen in one shot. You have to remember that we are at the top of the evolutionary ladder. Everything is down from where we are because we are the winners. You don't see all the failed routes. The failed routes didn't go anywhere. There are thousands and millions of failed routes. The only route that writes the history is the one successful one. That's us. So it's hard to get what we would technically call a measure, okay, of how often would something like life happen out of random chance, because we haven't done a controlled experiment. We are the control.
Thank you so very much. But this is a question that I face quite often. Why I, an ordinary citizen who is not a scientist, should know anything about what you talk today or anything about any other science? What's a good answer?
Because you are a sentient being and live your life. You can reflect on yourself. As far as we know, we are the only sentient beings. I'm not trying to deny cockroaches might be sentient. They don't talk to me, right? We reflect on ourselves. Why we do that is a deep mystery. Okay, but we do. We wonder about the purpose of meaning of life, everything, the universe. Okay, that's our natural bent. And therefore, it is perfectly appropriate that you should wonder about the universe, even if you make a living doing something else. And maybe, even though, of course, we can't be experts at everything, if some of us actually do this work, we are doing it on behalf of the entire civilization, just as some of us are painters, some of us are musicians. I know I'll never be a sitar player, but I can still enjoy listening to Nikhil Banerjee. So similarly, you could enjoy a good cosmology book without actually having to be a professional cosmologist. It just shows that the human mind is capable of a very wide variety, a very broadband set of activities. Why that is so, I don't know, but that's the way we are. So let's enjoy it. Exactly.
I have three crisp questions. One is, how many dimensions are there in the universe? Second one is, if the universe is expanding, what will happen after complete expansion? And third one is, at the time of Big Bang, the particle is monistic or dualistic?
You know very well, because you can walk this way or you can walk this way, and you can even jump up a little bit. So there are clearly 3 dimensions in the space that we inhabit, that we can experience. As to how many dimensions there might be, that question we can't answer. We have not found any new dimensions down to the smallest scales we have looked. So the smallest scales that we have looked to is, in fact, as I pointed out earlier, to about 10 to the minus 18 centimeters, which is here. So this is the size, the picture shows you. So this is the size of an atom, that is an amoeba. This is the size of the smallest scales that we are probing at this big collider in CERN. Up to that scale, we have not found any new dimensions. But in principle, there could be new dimensions on even smaller scales. They're tiny curled up dimensions, so you don't see them from our perspective. So the answer is there are 3 space and 1 time dimensions. There might be others, but we have not found them. Okay, the second question you had was, what was that? Yeah, what is the expansion going to go on forever? Answer is we don't know. Right now the expansion, some people claim, is speeding up. Okay, that evidence is being reassessed. It might turn out that actually we are going at a constant speed rather than speeding up. But be that as it may, it will continue for at least another 10-12 billion years, as long as we have been around so far, right? Ultimately, we don't know, because in order to predict that, we would have to follow this expansion for a sufficiently long time to make a clear estimate. So it's like I'm standing here and I see a stone flying past my window, somebody threw it up, right? And in the little time I have to make that measurement, I can guess that the stone is either going faster with time or slower with time, like it's going to fall down, or it is actually going to go off to infinity. But from this little snapshot, it's very hard to tell, right? It might look to me like it is going to carry on forever, go into orbit, or it might just go and lose energy and then fall down again, right? So we still can't decide between those options. And the third question was, what was the third question? Particle monistic or dualistic? I'm sorry, I don't understand what those terms are. So all the particles in the universe will dissolve and lose their identity in that initial singularity. There's no distinction between them anymore. So there's no monistic, dualistic, it is multi-everything, okay? So this picture says that as we go back to smaller and smaller scales, we have already dissolved nuclei into atoms. The nuclei will dissolve into the constituent particles like quarks and leptons, right? Ultimately, we don't know what's going on here. It might turn out that quarks and leptons are different aspects of the same unified field, and that unified field might well turn out to have something to do with gravity. We don't know the answer to any of these questions. That's why we are still doing research. Yes, but I'm saying that this part, which is what you are interested in, we actually know nothing about yet. We are doing research on it. So, of course, I can always make a claim that at this point something or the other is the case, but I'm saying we cannot directly observe it and verify it. It is a conjecture. You can always make a conjecture. That's
next question. And I feel that's the right thing I've done today.
There are, by the way, thousands and thousands of scientists in Hyderabad. This city is very, lucky to have so many top institutes of science and technology. Go on.
But from whatever I heard, you're so amazing, sir. You're so brilliant in the sense, like the wealth of knowledge. Thank you very much. Sir, my question is this. Let's say you can 100 years from now, exactly today, 100 years from now.
Yes.
So as a person, personally, this question is for me to understand you. What is that one thing as a scientist that you want to know by the last moment before
I die? I'm interested as a theorist in something called the cosmological constant problem. So there is a very deep problem in physics, which is to understand technically why this explanation that I gave, that all particles are excitations in fields which pervade the universe. Those fields have something called zero-point energy, quantum mechanical energy. Even when everything is at rest in the ground state, they still have energy. And if you add up that energy, it's a huge energy. According to Einstein, all forms of energy should couple to gravity. However, it is obvious that this energy of this vacuum does not couple to gravity, because if it did, we would not be here. The universe would have collapsed to the singularity. It would never have become as large as it is today. So we don't understand what is the nature of vacuum energy and how it couples to gravity. This is technically called the cosmological constant problem. And this is something that the best physicists have struggled with, and we have not found an explanation. So we can see that either as negative, that we have failed. I see it as positive, which means that the next generation has something to sort out. Okay, we have not solved everything. So I would like, before I die, to know what is the explanation of the cosmological constant problem. But my fear is that I will not understand the explanation. You see, it's not enough to ask a question. You must also know the language in which the answer will come. So the explanation for how space-time and gravity interact required, as I said, the invention of something called tensor calculus. Without that, you could not have formulated the theory. And most people of the time did not actually understand the theory of general relativity. It was mathematically too complicated for them. Okay? In a previous time, you had to have the theory of matrices to understand quantum mechanics. In fact, Heisenberg, who invented quantum mechanics, one of the co-inventors, he actually didn't realize that he was multiplying matrices when he was doing operations in quantum mechanics. That came to be called matrix mechanics. So every advance in science needs an advance in mathematics to reveal this new layer. And at some point, you know, hopefully I'll be able to keep abreast, but I might not be able to keep abreast of the next real development in mathematics. I mean, the development might already be there. It needs a physicist to identify which bit of mathematics is relevant to the physical world. And just to complete my answer, this does not always work. I mean, there was a famous physicist in Edinburgh. He thought that different kinds of atoms, chemical elements, correspond to different kinds of knots. You know, you can tie knots in a string, and there are many, many ways you can tie a knot. And he thought every kind of knot is a different kind of atom. Turned out that this was not true, right? But he invented something called knot theory, okay, mathematically. And that's turned out to be a very important part of what's called superstring theory now. So it's not that any of these things are wasted, but they don't always turn out to be relevant to the physical world, right? So what we are waiting for now, I think, is a major progress in identifying some bit of mathematics, hopefully already existing, that will solve the problem of
universe be decreasing, because the furthest most stars that we see are the stars that existed almost 12 billion years ago. So if we are able to see those stars, they must be pretty huge stars, massive stars, which means they must be black holes by now. And aren't black holes supposed to be absorbing everything that come their way and breaking them down to the smallest particles? So shouldn't they be like absorbing?
Okay, so sorry, the Hubble deep field is what I was after. Yeah, this picture here. So what you see here are the oldest galaxies in the universe, okay? These pinpricks of light, some of them, as was shown in the next slide, right, is in fact 12 billion years ago, we actually saw. So this is the galaxy today, like our galaxy, right? This is the age 14 billion years. 9 billion years ago, we of course don't see our own galaxy, we are sitting in it, but we see galaxies which are like ours today, but which looked earlier like that, and like that, and like that. And as you go back in time, you see that the stars in them were bluer, younger, the spectrum was different, right? But they don't have to be massive, they have to be just enough stars to explain the light that we actually measure here, okay? Those stars had different chemical composition, because in this intervening 12 billion years, many of them have exploded, they have distributed their heavy elements into the interstellar medium. So the later generation of stars forms from a matter which is different, it is enriched in heavy elements than the first stars, right? So today the heavy elements that you are made of, as you know, they all came from supernovae, they all came from exploding stars. We are all stardust, as a famous popularizer of science, Carl Sagan, said, right? But the point is that some of those stars have become black holes. At the center of every galaxy like this, there is a massive black hole of 100 million or 1,000 million solar masses. And we are now measuring them. Recently, we actually made the first ever picture of a black hole in a galaxy just like this. They don't all turn into black holes. You have a central black hole, and then you have lots of 10, 20 solar mass black holes peppered through the system. Some of them are not even in galaxies. We have seen the merger of black holes now in gravitational waves. So basically we are beginning to find out about things because you have finally found the means to detect black holes from their mergers by using the gravitational waves that they emit, right? And that took 46 years from the time when people started thinking about it to the discovery by LIGO, right? All these things take time and engineering and science. And, you know, the people who are young like you when they started on that are today old people, okay? Because Kip Thorne, who was one of the guys who got the Nobel Prize, he told me he started thinking about gravitational waves at a young age, and now he's retired, right? And now finally he's got his Nobel Prize, right? So it takes time. So we can't rush the answers. We have to develop our science, we have to build the instruments, you have to further our knowledge, and then step by step we'll build on what you have had before, on all the people who have come before us. So it's not a single individual like Hawking or Newton who advances science, it's the entire community working together. Okay? Of course, some of us are, you know, more, sometimes there is a genius like Einstein who actually makes huge progress, certainly, but everything is built on this gradual expansion of our knowledge. So the observation that we make of the distant stars show that they were stars just like the ones in our galaxy, right? Except that they had smaller metal content, smaller heavy elements, right? And they were less luminous. Now stars will of course live for 14 billion. Our sun will live for another 5 billion years, but then it will become a red giant. It will swallow us up. So I don't know what will kill us first, Andromeda hitting us or the sun swallowing us up. But this will not turn into a black hole. According to our calculations, the sun is too light. You need something which is at least 7-8 times the mass of the sun to become a black hole. The black holes we have seen in gravitational waves are much heavier. They're about 20-30 times the mass of the sun. We still don't understand where they came from. So these are all topics of active research. So if you want your questions answered, I suggest you embark on, what are you studying? Third year computer science. Drop computer science, do cosmology. And after about 6-7 years, you would have got to the beginning of asking the question that you just asked, right? And then it'll take you another 40 years, but it'll be rewarding, I tell you.